Hello and welcome to week 6. This week we move on to the writing of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his book Emile, which he wrote his particular ideas about education, and you'll find that they're in contrast to Locke's in many ways. There are a few small similarities, but I think this gives you an alternate view of education, something different than the blank slate, everybody's equal, everyone can be taught in a reasonable way, and moves us into something a little different, which, like Locke, still has effects in the way children are educated and the way people parent today.
So when we talked about Locke, we talked about him as sort of the precursor of the Enlightenment, which was a 18th century movement that valued reason and order and predictability and suggested that people were very rational. You could talk to children rationally, that they wanted to be treated this way, that you could predict human events by looking at the patterns and that sort of thing, very scientific. And Romanticism is the movement that reacted against the Enlightenment, that suggested that sort of focus on logic and reason missed a big piece of what it means to be human. And so it really emphasized emotion, passion, the irrational, the supernatural, the exotic. And so, for instance, in this painting here by Thomas Cole of the American landscape, I don't know if you've ever seen an American landscape that looks like that. I've certainly seen one that feels like that, that you can feel like that in nature. And so the Romantics really idealized nature, both in the sense of the nature kind of trees sort of thing, but also human nature. And we'll talk about that a lot with Rousseau. So it was a reaction against this nice orderly package of things, and that said, no, wait, each individual is different. And so this quote that we pulled from Rousseau, I think, captures part of the Romantic mentality, where he says, do the opposite of what is usually done, and you will almost always be right. This idea that you can't just accept the status quo, that you have to think for yourself, that you have to think as an individual and live your own life in a different way. And so Rousseau, as you'll notice, lived in the 1700s. Romanticism was mostly a movement of the 1800s, so he was considered to be the father of Romanticism. I think it's interesting, by the way, that Locke preceded the Enlightenment, but kind of gave some of the ideals on which the Enlightenment was based, and Rousseau preceded Romanticism. So each of them was kind of a fish out of water in his own time, really thinking progressively, thinking about something different. Rousseau was a famous composer in his own lifetime, spent much of his time studying music, writing music. For instance, you may recognize this tune. Dun 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 dun. In America, we sing that as "Go Tell Aunt Rhody that the old gray goose is dead." I think Rousseau, I don't know, maybe he'd laugh at that. He wrote it for an opera, as a gavotte, a dance in an opera. He was also a political philosopher like Locke, and so if you study political science and political philosophy, chances are you are going to have Locke and Rousseau battling it out in their texts, just as they do in education, which to me is really fascinating. I've been thinking a lot lately about the connections between education and politics, because any educational theory that you present necessarily has a political side to it. Yes. And so we're not going to go too far into that in this class, but it's certainly there to explore. So Rousseau's idea of nature, of human nature, is that it is unspoiled, that everyone starts out perfect in the world, but as they encounter civilization, they become worse and worse. And maybe he's speaking partly of his own experience.
I don't know, is he crushed like the little weed between the sidewalk blocks?
I think he certainly felt that he didn't fit in his own society. But his educational theories, like Locke's, have had a wide influence. And one of the most significant present influences, I think, is on schools like the Montessori school. Sorry, got a little company in here. The Montessori school, schools throughout the country and the world that emphasize self-guided learning, have students pursue their own interests, not limited by, okay, we only have 50 minutes to spend on this, and so your interest should span 50 minutes. So if you are interested, or if you agree at all with the idea that learning doesn't fit nicely into little blocks of time spread out across a schedule, then you're thinking a lot like Rousseau, who believed that we didn't want to impose these sort of limits, rational limits, on something that was not so rational and much more emotional.
The current popularity of the unschooling movement, some of you may have heard about that, it's like homeschooling to an extreme, draws as its basis basic philosophy it draws from Rousseau. This idea that children need to learn from experience and they need to follow their interests. So we're going to start at the end because I have issues. I have issues with Rousseau. I was fine with him until I got to book 5, and then he got into his, I was thinking he was so progressive, and then he got into his gender-based education, and his views of men and women just, I have issues. So I'm imagining some of you do too, so Jen is going to help us work through these issues.
Well, it's not to say that I don't have issues. There are certainly things that I read in Rousseau book 5. For instance, the line that says, "The male is only a male at times, the female is a female all her life and can never forget her sex." That I don't agree with that. But I do want to point out, first of all, that a lot of the ideas that Rousseau is working with in book 5 are ideas we've seen before. This is not so different, perhaps different in the way it's articulated. Maybe it's not said so elegantly as Castiglione says it, but the same idea that we've been grappling with and will grapple with again is, if men and women are different, then how should education reflect and enhance those differences rather than trying to make everyone sexless?
Well, my issue here is with Rousseau is he seems to have left his thinking cap off when he got to book 5, because he's talked about this natural state of children and how I'm losing my train of thought here. But this natural state of children and how they need to be educated in a different way than what has been the norm, in this non-rational way. They shouldn't be treated as rational creatures. They should go toward what they're interested in, and he's seeing a different kind of child than others, the Lockean view. And then he gets to girls, women, young women, and he seems to see them in a very conventional way. So for someone who's been looking outside of convention up until this point, for him to suddenly look at girls and say, oh, well, they're just naturally obedient, right? Is your daughter always naturally obedient?
No.
No, neither is mine, and she doesn't seem to think it's the natural state of things. Neither did I, or any of my sisters.
Although I have to think that I don't think he thinks that they are naturally obedient, which is why they have to learn it. They have to cultivate. It's interesting that he suggests that cultivating her understanding and reason will lead women to want to present the appearance of subservience. And so I think he's even conflicted with himself, because at the end of book 5 he talks about the mutual dependence of Emile and Sophie, that they need each other. Although for so much of book 5 he seems to suggest that Sophie exists only to serve Emile.
Well, yes, except at the beginning of book 5 here, he's talking about these power relations, which are, okay, I realize that stereotypes start somewhere, and these have been going on for centuries, but again, he seems to really not be thinking very clearly, where he's saying it starts in the bottom of page 144 and goes up through 145, and this is the idea that he returns to with Sophie and Emile at the end, which is that, okay, the man is supposed to be active and strong, and the woman is supposed to be passive and weak. This is the law of nature. However, the strength of women is in her charms, and it is her duty to bring out his powers, help the man discover his powers through the use of her charms. So she brings him into his manhood by either rewarding or denying him her charms.
But that's a huge position of power.
It is. It's an absolute huge position of power, but I think it's a limiting view of both men and women.
Certainly, but is that so different from Castiglione's idea of the elegant hostess who's able to network really effectively? I mean, it seems interesting to me that that skill is one that we now suggest everybody needs to have. So we've said, oh, it's not just a skill for women anymore. That could be a bumper sticker, right? Charms, not just for women anymore.
I do like that. I think that's fun. But this idea that she's supposed to make him appear that he is in control, but actually she's controlling him, and it reads to me like she is controlling him through sex.
Oh, I didn't take it that way at all.
Oh, I think she is.
Well, that's not how I read it. I read it that much more like that she makes him dependent on her. He counts on her for his confidence.
He counts on her for sex.
Yes, in addition to other things.
I think this is where I think this is a huge part of it, is because he's talking about man's natural desires that cannot be wholly met, except
When he talks about the puberty part, for sure.
Oh, like definitely about the puberty part and pre-puberty before they get there and they lose their heads. So, and this is an idea that has come up over and over in time, that men somehow need to be tamed and civilized through their attraction to women who withhold their favors until the men do what they want.
Well, isn't that happening or has been happening in an African country recently, that the women have said, we are going to withhold sexual favors from our husbands? It's the Lysistrata, I mean, it's based on a Greek play, but this idea that until you guys get the civil war under control, I mean, I don't know all the details, I've just heard about it on the radio, so not so far.
Well, no, I mean, I know that this is an idea that has been out there forever, and I find it demeaning to both men and women that that's the way to control men, and that is the way to control them.
Yeah.
And that men need to be controlled in ways different than women need to be controlled.
Well, there's that whole book that came out a few years ago where a woman wrote about that she could tame her husband the same way that she trained her dog, and that there was a lot of backlash against that. I mean, but she was playing on the same kind of idea, saying, okay, you know, women, you want to have power, well, this is how you do it. And not sex, by the way, in her book, but of other kinds of rewards. Yeah, food,
that's how I train
praise,
my dog, is with
that
food.
sort of thing. So, I think that there's a lot of room for interpretation in here. I do want to point out that for his time, Rousseau was progressive in many ways. The fact that he believed that women were capable of reason, that they could do these things consciously, that these were choices that they made, and that it could be in their best interest to use their intellect and their cunning, as he calls it, in interesting, in powerful ways. I think it's progressive, but as we'll see when we get to Wollstonecraft, there's, you know, not everybody agrees with it. But for the time that he's writing in the 1700s, there are many things that are progressive about this.
Well, if Castiglione thought it was thinking that, and he was thinking that in the 1500s, how progressive is this?
Gosh, Rousseau, you should be farther along. Anyway, there's way more that we could talk about with this, but we want to go to the meat of, I mean, this is certainly part of Rousseau. We'll come back to this idea again of gender-based education and
this
men and
does
women.
set us up for Wollstonecraft well.
But the heart of Rousseau's educational theory for all children is that education should be natural. And this quote that I alluded to before, he says that everything is good as it comes from the hands of the maker of the world, but degenerates once it gets into the hands of man. And so that the job of educators, as opposed to what Locke says, you know, in terms of writing on this blank slate that needs to be filled up, the job of educators, in Rousseau's view, is to stay out of the way, to spoil children, I mean, to ruin them as little as possible, and I guess spoil in that conventional sense too.
Well, he wants you to remove the obstacles that could get in the way of their natural blossoming, which I think is different, much different than just not doing anything.
Sorry, what's that?
Because he's not advocating not doing anything and letting the children have whatever they want and do whatever they want at all.
And he specifically says,
yes.
no, the surest way to make your child unhappy is to accustom him to get everything he wants. So this is not indulgent education. I mean, Emile has rules and he's told no a lot, right? But that he is also not, you know, strapped down to a chair in a cave, being forced to look at shadows all day long.
Right.
That he is out experiencing the world as appropriate for his age. And so that's something that you may have noticed, that these chapters are arranged in terms of this idea of child development, which is a relatively new idea at the time that Rousseau presents it. You think about Plato saying, oh, send all the kids into the country at the age of 10 and let them, you know, be separated from their parents. I mean, I don't think Rousseau would go for that. But he believes and presents this idea that children aren't ready for Lockean education at a young age, that they're not ready to be taught to in a rational way, which I can understand. I mean, I find myself torn between Locke and Rousseau, because I read Locke and I think, oh, that makes a lot of sense, and then I read Rousseau and I think, oh wait, that makes a lot of sense too.
I have my Locke days and my Rousseau days, and you know, my poor child is probably very confused.
So, I mean, this idea that you only want to give children information when it's going to be meaningful to them, I think is a fascinating one for educators. You know, how often do we give children information that we say, well, just memorize this algorithm, or memorize these facts. Yes, this is what the Civil War was fought over, X, Y, Z, and they don't understand anything about war, they don't understand anything about why people might fight each other. And so he says, don't tell them that stuff yet. Wait till they're ready for it, wait till they want it. and then they'll learn it much more effectively.
And they need to be able to come to their own exact ideas about what something is first before they learn more about it.
Right.
Because if they don't have an idea of what war is, or the practical applications of mathematics, it's going to be meaningless to them.
Exactly. Wasted time. And so, as opposed to the Lockean idea of trying to, set up, one idea and then build on that next idea and build on that next idea, Rousseau is takes a more hands-off educational approach, and that students, that children should get that information as they want it. So they should not get these habits. You should not just let them get into these habits of living, but they should act deliberately. Sounds like Thoreau as I'm talking.
Well,
Dead Poet Society.
Well, one of the things that I like about, and this is something where I see both Locke and Rousseau in comparison, is they seem to be in their writing, very loving toward children and observant of them, and indulgent may not be the right word, but when Rousseau says on page 126, your first duty is to be humane. Love childhood. Look with friendly eyes on its games, its pleasures, its amiable dispositions. Which of you does not sometimes look back regretfully on the age when laughter was ever on the lips and the heart free of care? So, I mean, he kind of romanticizes childhood, but I mean, he sees that it's this very special, unique time where kids should not be, beaten into submission, but where we really let them develop their own individual natures.
Right. And that really goes into this idea of self-guided education. And so I pulled a couple of quotes here out of Rousseau. First, on page 126, he says, "The supreme good is not authority, but freedom. The true free man wants only what he can get and does only what pleases him." And on the surface, this may sound very selfish, but I think what he's suggesting is that the only education that truly matters is that education that seems relevant, right? That when we learn those things that we are interested in, that are going to help us meet a need, then we're going to really learn them, as opposed to those things that we just memorize and forget. And he gives a specific example of this, of reading, which really has stuck in my head, that he calls reading the greatest plague of childhood. He says, it's not to say that I don't want kids to be able to read. It's important that they read, but they need to read because they want to read, not because we are forcing them to. And he said, instead of you coming up with all these games and incentives to try to make them want to read, you just help them find something they really want to read. For instance, a letter, like to talk about Emile receiving a letter from his father and saying, oh, you can't read this, that's too bad. And then, and I have to say, that's how I learned to read, is that I came from a big family, and my mom read to us quite a bit, but never as much as I wanted her to read to me. And so I picked up the books that she read to me, and I would go into the room and I'd say, Mom, what does this word say? And she would tell me, and I'd go back in my room, and then I'd come back out and say, Mom, what does this word say? And so I memorized the books that she had read to me because I wanted to read these books and no one could read. Now, this is before a lot of TV. Well, there was TV, but I couldn't listen to these books on CD. I didn't have other options. And so in this sense, at least, I think, man, Rousseau knows what he's talking about. And I imagine that many of you have had times where there was something that you learned because you really wanted to, not because you were getting a grade for it, not because it was a required skill in school. And in fact, this week's discussion board will give you a chance to talk about some of those things, I think. Oh, so that's the end of our recording. Hold on. I want to go back.
We're not done.
Just a second. To wrap this up a little bit, I didn't give us a nice good slide. Sorry, this is a little sloppy this time.
One of the things another thing that I appreciate about Rousseau is that he sees the way that he advocates educating a child as helping them to develop their independence and self-reliance, which is not, I think, in direct opposition to Locke. It just seems to be finding a different method to do it. And then he also has this claim about reason. He thinks children are too young to learn reason, and it's on page 127. And I think this is interesting because of the ways that it fits in with the Republic as well. But he says, he's arguing directly against Locke right here, saying Locke says you should reason with children, and it's very popular today, but he doesn't see that it's justified. And because he says a reasonable man is the masterwork of a good education. That's what you end up with. The result of your education is the ability to reason, that it doesn't come first. And so he sees a very ordered progression to what he's getting to. He thinks Locke is starting at the end.
Right.
and he wants to start at the beginning. So he sees a much different beginning for people than Locke does.
And I think that's a really interesting point. As a teacher, I know that there is certainly a movement for teachers now to explain everything that they are doing to students in terms of how they help to meet learning objectives. And but there are sometimes I think that you can't necessarily understand the value of what you're learning until you have more perspective on it, right? That later on you say, oh, I'm so glad I learned that thing that I couldn't appreciate at the time. And so I think that has to do with that growing ability to reason. And you know, that by the time you get to the end, then you can say, oh, now I can understand this intellectually, where before I understood it because I did this because it was fun, or I did it because my teacher made it interesting, or because that's what my dad liked to do. And now with reason I can understand that in a different way. So there's plenty more in Rousseau here that we haven't gotten to, and that we're not going to get to, but hopefully that you will. Hopefully some things that you feel strongly about, but pay attention to the way that Rousseauian ideas about education are still present. Our society seems torn, again, between, and not necessarily between just Locke and Rousseau, but between the idea of how much freedom do we give people in their learning, or how much do we require them to learn certain things, how much do we justify what we're learning, what they're learning because of reason, or how much do we do it to try to make it fun, try to make it entertaining for them.
Yeah. This will be fun because this bleeds beyond education. It bleeds into parenting and into politics and into your view of the world. And I think that's what makes it such a rich reading experience and thinking experience.